Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, students, this is lecture number 14 on discourse analysis. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss the critical discourse analysis and how it evaluates the power relations in the text. Regarding the lecture, we are going to discuss an overview of critical discourse analysis and 6 common features of critical discourse analysis, and to find out the kinds of texts and levels of analysis. Students, Fairclough's version of critical discourse analysis distinguishes discursive from non-discursive dimensions of communication and is concerned with the ways in which discourses act to produce and change the world. It attempts to engage critically, hence critical discourse analysis, with the discourses produced by dominant institutions such as the government in order to show how the texts they produce recreate particular versions of the world. For example, Fairclough, Van Dyke. Fairclough's critical discourse analysis is thus also a theory of the subject and of agency, in that it is concerned with the relationship between language, the subject, and the social processes, viewing the subject as capable of influencing perceptions of the world and thus of changing things through his or her use of language. Students, following Fairclough and Woodruff Phillips, identify 6 common features among the diverse versions of critical discourse analysis that exist. Students, the first one is the understanding that language and discursive practice, how texts are produced and consumed, contribute to the constitution of the world. The notion that discourse is both constituted by and constitutes the social cultural world. And third, the focus on actual language use within a given context as the object of research. The notion that discourse is invested and contributes to the production of power relations in society and to the interpretive schema operating within a given society. Fifth one is the notion that discourse is historically situated, hence contingent and subject to change. The sixth one, the demand that discourse analysis should be concerned with a critical examination of language in order to promote change. Students, language thus simultaneously refers to the world and constructs it through imbuing it with particular meanings. When Jane Austen, in the opening sentence of Pride and Prejudice, claims that it is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife, she not so much proclaims a neutral and objective fact as muster her rhetorical face to offer a particular confirmation of a specific kind of single man. That rhetorical force sets out both to avoid a certain view and simultaneously and implicitly to disown other ways of seeing. It thus seeks to set up Austen's particular view of a single man as the only way of viewing him, without, however, making that explicit by referencing either an author or a narrator figure through qualifying the statement by a phrase such as "in my opinion." Austen's rhetorical resources include For example, the use of a present tense and indicative verb form "it is," which suggests fact and underscore validity, followed by a truth claim reinforced through an adverbial adjectival assertion of generalizability. A truth universally acknowledged, in order to lend persuasiveness to her view and assert the normativity of a position that would not necessarily be shared, for example, by men who might be single and in possession of a good fortune, but not in want of a wife. Thus, while constructing a word of normative heterosexuality, Austen's introduction simultaneously attempts to close down the possibility of other ways of reading the situation of a man in the position described. Students, here we are already in the midst of discourse analysis, which, as this brief example demonstrates, involves the close textual analysis of the linguistic and semantic features of a text in order to establish the meanings the text seeks to impose on the word and by implication on the reader. Students, such an analysis may focus on a small segment of a text, or as is more common, range over a larger amount of text, from a brief paragraph to all the plays by and attributed to Shakespeare, or the entire output of a particular journal, magazine, or newspaper, such as the Edinburgh Reviewer, the term used to describe large sets of texts or data, such as the latter is corpus or corpora in the plural. Students, however, rather than merely describing a text's linguistic features, the purpose of discourse analysis is to reveal how such features set up and replicate particular world views. Thus, the fact that Jane Austen describes a single man in possession of a good fortune as in want of a wife, as opposed to, for instance, France, indicate the commitment to marriage the text seeks to promote in its focus on heteronormativity. The kind of knowledge discourse analysis may then produce is an understanding of the implicit rules and norms that govern language use in a specific context, to make explicit the ideological assumptions that govern that use, and by making the later explicit, to point to possibilities of assistance or other ways of reading. Students, as Robert Scholes suggested, we need to view the literary text as the product of a person or persons at a given point in human history in a given form of discourse, taking its meaning from the interpretive gestures of individual readers, using the grammatical, semantic, and cultural codes available to them. Students, one effect of this is that discussions of discourse and of discourse analysis tend to focus on texts in areas that produce ideological contention. Mills, for instance, discusses sexist and racist discourses as a way of laying bare the operations of language use in the articulation of particular value systems. Similarly, Fairclough, in New Labour, New Language, seeks to reveal how manipulating language to control public perception is a vital aspect of New Labour politics. Students, we are all familiar with the ways in which the language of business and institutions seeks to to represent problems as opportunities to provide a positive and supposedly energizing spin on a difficult situation. Many special issues of discourse and society have been devoted to the ways in which contentious political situations have been variously and contradictorily represented in the different discourses politicians and others employ to influence public opinion. Students, this brings us to the question of what kinds of texts might be analyzed using discourse analysis within the frame of English studies. Here, the first thing to note is that while English studies has sometimes been narrowly viewed as the study of literature, that is the study of high literary forms and of a set of specific authors' works, the question of what is literature and indeed what its purpose is raised particularly vigorously in and since the canon debates of the late 1970s and early 1980s has itself become a matter of contestation. Students, the effect of this has been that the field of English studies at the beginning of the 21st century has expanded to encompasses all manner of texts and by all manners of writers who were not part of the canon of literature and formed the backbone of the teaching of English literature until the mid-1970s. Students, for example, in the 1980s and particularly the 1990s, there was a turn in English literature towards science. This was promoted by the drive of public educational policies towards enhancing the public understanding of science as part of the demise of the welfare state and the promotion inaugurated under the conservative government of Margaret Thatcher and continued under the Labour government of Tony Blair of consumer choice and individual responsibility. Students, this turn has meant that different kinds of texts from science, including from fields such as medicine, biology, zoology, and anthropology, have been revised by English literature scholars in order to explore the interrelationship between the kinds of narratives we produce about our world in different domains and the impact that these narratives have. Students, one need only think of works such as Beard's Darwin's Plots or Jonathan Shardy's The Body Emblazoned to recognize the impact of this turn to science on English studies as a field. Discourse analysis as a research method for English studies may then not be confined to the study of literature as a high cultural form. It can be applied to many different kinds of texts, including not least verbal ones, such as interviews with writers, for instance. Students, in this lecture, in her chapter on ethnography in this volume, Rachel Alsop, for instance, briefly discusses the ways in which cultural crisis Mary-Louise Pratt has described ethnographic narratives as either utopic or dystopic, depending on their narrative are and on how the ethnographer positions him or herself in this or her narrative. Student studies of ethnography is as texts with specific narrative structure may well then, and indeed too in the context of travel writing, for instance, form part of what might be termed English studies. The point is that the field of English studies has widened considerably during the past 30 years or so. The kind of texts a researcher working with discourse analysis as a research method might focus on thus depends on the knowledge he or she wants to produce. He or she may focus on high cultural texts, but is not restricted to these. Students, as previously stated, discourse analysis may be carried out on very brief texts. For instance, one of the shorter short stories of Bert Pritchett or Borges, or on extensive bodies of texts or corpora. Students, this means that no discourse analysis will ever be complete, since it is beyond the scope of a single research project to analyze all the textual features contained in any but the briefest text. Students, when conducting discourse analysis, a researcher therefore of necessity has to be selective, concentrating on certain textual features at the expense of others. This also means that all analyses are partial, influenced by the researcher's agenda, and thus, just like the texts under scrutiny, historically situated. Treather therefore makes the point that the analyst must decide how much detail the data encompass, and that the data thus are not given but need to be selected according to the analyst's focus. Students, to mitigate the effect of the selectivity of the researcher when analyzing different discourses, many writers on discourse analysis as a research method recommend that researchers make a description of the research process part of their analysis and be as explicit as possible in their description of how they conducted their research and choices they made. For example, Phillips and Taylor did in 2002 and 2001. This requires reflexivity on the part of researcher, the ability to think critically about his or her actions and reactions in relation to the text studied. Explicitness, transparency, and reflexivity are the key words here, even as the issue of researchers themselves being framed by the discourses they examine, and the question of how they can step outside these to reflect on their own practices remains. Students, such a reflection on one's research practice, still largely uncommon in English studies, is routinely practiced in other disciplines such as women's studies, and is one of the valuable practices that could usefully be adopted in English. Okay, students, see you in the class, and you must listen and read this lecture, and after that you may ask any question regarding this lecture and regarding the previous one. Okay, see you, students.